Samuel Harrell's autopsy ruled his death as a clear homicide. He was beaten black and blue. This was clearly a murder. But corrupt people in power are doing everything they can to cover this one up and try to sweep this case under the rug. So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about the murder of Samuel Harrell. But before we get into it, I do just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming service that I have used for years and loved for years. They have so many amazing documentaries under so many different genres: science, earth, space, history, and of course, true crime, my favourite genre. I'm always on the lookout through their new releases for new stuff to watch, and one that I watched recently that I highly recommend to you guys was My Social Network Stalker. This documentary follows the story of a woman named Ruth who was stalked and harassed over social media for 3 years, and her stalker was doing literally everything they could to try and ruin Ruth's life. It was a really impactful documentary to watch because Ruth could be anyone. Like, that could be any one of us, because most of us, if not all of us, have social media. And you never know who's following you and who's watching what you're posting. But the person that was doing this to Ruth this whole time was actually much closer to home than you would expect, which is the most horrifying part of this documentary. So not only do I recommend that documentary, but Magellan TV also upload between 15 and 20 hours of new content every single week, so you're never gonna get bored. Magellan TV is also completely ad-free, and you can watch on pretty much any device that you have, so what are you waiting for? They're offering you guys a 1-month free trial when you click the link down below in the description of this video, and I do highly recommend. I've recommended you so many documentaries on there by now. I've watched nearly every single one, and I love them. So yeah, thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Now, before we get into it, I do just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this case. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. A couple of content warnings before we get into this one. We are going to be discussing torture, racism, and bipolar disorder is quite a big theme in the beginning of this case. So if any of that is something that you don't want to hear about right now, I completely understand. Click out of this video, go look after yourself, and hopefully I'll catch you again with a different case another time. All that being said, let's get into the case. Today's murder case actually takes place inside of a prison in New York, and our victim was Mr. Samuel Harrell. Samuel was born in Houston, Texas on December 18th, 1984. In fact, he was named Samuel Harrell III. Both his father and his grandfather were both Samuel Harrells. He was part of a long line. To avoid confusion, Samuel was given a nickname in school. He was called J-Rock. But I mean, for the sake of this video, I am going to call him his legal name, Samuel Harrell. Samuel was described as a joker. He always wanted to make people laugh. He was always cracking jokes. In fact, he always just wanted to make people smile, make people happy. His sister said he was a sweetheart and cared about everyone. He was always willing to help anybody if he could. But underneath this happy-go-lucky exterior, Samuel had some internal struggles, and in 2010 he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He was suffering quite badly from paranoia, delusions, sometimes even hallucinations. Some of the things that would happen to him were he would think that all of the family photos in the house were staring at him, and so he would have to turn them over or like take them down off the walls. Sometimes he would even have to turn the TV off because he would feel like it was talking like directly to him. He was put on medication to try and manage these symptoms, and it did work to a degree, although Samuel wouldn't always take his medication, and so sometimes these delusions and paranoia, it would come back intermittently, like throughout his life. But all of his family helped and supported him through this, especially his partner named Diane, who he actually ended up marrying. Now, Diane actually had a couple of kids to a previous relationship herself, and when she married Samuel Harrell, he took on Diane's 2 kids as his own, and he loved them. He was a father figure to them, a really good one at that. So he had this happy little family. Everything was going quite well for him in his life. However, Samuel Harrell did not have the most legitimate job known to man. He was a drug dealer, and it was very risky business, and in 2014, he was caught. He was sentenced to 8 years for drug dealing, and he was due to serve this sentence in Fishkill Correctional Facility, which is a prison in New York. And due to his bipolar disorder, Samuel was even put in like a special building in this prison that housed all the inmates that had different mental illnesses or disorders or whatever. I suppose just keeping them all in the same area made it easier to monitor them and care for them. So Samuel went to Fishkill Correctional Facility. He settled in rather well, and he starts serving this sentence. However, just a few months in, Samuel received the devastating news that his mother had passed away, and he hadn't even been able to say goodbye to her. And he really, really struggled to deal with this. He fell into a deep depression, and he started acting out. I don't know what that means in terms of like prison staff reporting that he was acting out. I don't know what that means. But regardless, Samuel was really struggling mentally, and the guards and the prison staff at Fishkill just turned a blind eye to his struggle. If anything, they actually started punishing him for it. He was regularly beaten and abused by the prison staff. I don't know if this was exclusive to Samuel Harrell. I don't think it was. I think that was just how the guards and the staff were in this particular prison. It seemed like an awful place to be. And on the occasions that he would stand up for himself and he would try and defend himself in front of these guards, they would throw him in solitary confinement, which is an awful punishment at the best of times, but especially so for Samuel Harrell because allegedly they would refuse him his bipolar medication when he was in solitary. And so, of course, this would bring back all of his paranoia, all of his delusions, even hallucinations. Now that he's in this tiny room on his own, he was really, really suffering. And he would try and tell the staff that he was struggling, but they would just ignore him time and time again. And so his mental health would just spiral. And then on April 21st, 2015, Samuel was struck with another one of his delusions. This time, he believed that he was being let out of prison, and he thought that that same evening he was going to go home to his wife and to his kids, and he was going to see his sister. And at 8 p.m. that night, he even started like packing up his bags, ready to leave. He was telling all his friends, all his inmate friends, that he was going. He was even talking to guards about it, like about when he leaves. And he wasn't leaving. This was a delusion. He still had a good few years on his sentence. No one had told him that he was leaving. That's how they knew that this was another one of his delusions. And he really did believe it. Like I said, he was packing his bags. And his inmate friends are watching him do this, and they're really concerned, to the point where they actually grabbed him and took him to one of the correctional officers, and they were like, look, Samuel needs immediate medical attention. He is struggling here. Now, before we get further into this story, I do have to let you know that the details in this case are rather vague because this all happened inside prison walls. Obviously, think about the kind of people that we're getting witness testimonies from here. Police, prison guards, sergeants, all people that are part of the system. So just bear that in mind as you're hearing this story, that it was all dictated by their witness accounts. Those are the only people that have ever told this story. So it's actually believed that Samuel Harrell was rather calm throughout this whole thing because, remember, he was just having delusions. He just thought he was going home. If anything, he was really happy and he was really calm. He thought that he was going to see his wife and his kids and his sister. These weren't necessarily harmful delusions in the way that they weren't violent. He wasn't angry. It wasn't troublesome in any way. It was just kind of sad that he believed this and people had to tell him that it wasn't going to happen. So yeah, reports say that he was very calm as all of this was going on. But suddenly, all of that changes as soon as one of the higher-up officers gets involved, a Sergeant Guarino. So Sergeant Guarino was brought in, and he was supposed to know what to do in this instance. And is the obvious answer not to get Samuel Harrell some medication, get him back on the medication, put him under surveillance and make sure that he's okay? That's the obvious answer, is it not? But that's not what Sergeant Guarino did. Instead, he sent out a red dot alarm, which sounds out to the whole prison to let them know that an inmate is engaging in inappropriate physical resistance to guards. That doesn't sound like what Samuel Harrell is doing right now, does it? Reports say that at this point in time, as Sergeant Guarino sends out this alert, Samuel Harrell was just sat calmly by the desk. Like, he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't even stood up. He wasn't even talking to anyone. He wasn't resisting anything. Within minutes of this red dot alarm being sounded, Samuel Harrell was surrounded by 20 police officers. Bear in mind, most of these officers, prison guards, are the ones that have been abusing him the whole time that he's been in there, torturing him, beating him. And reports say that Samuel Harrell did not take well to being surrounded at this point in time. They say that it just kind of set off his fight or flight instinct, and if anything, it just exacerbated his current mental health situation, which was that he was really mentally unwell. Supposedly, Samuel tried to get out of this situation. He tried to stand up out of his chair and walk down the corridor. But of course, prison guards weren't having that. He was chased down this corridor and tackled to the ground. He fell face first into the concrete floor. And now that the prison guards had Samuel Harrell on the ground, they began torturing him. They were beating him, they were kicking him, they were stomping on his head, on his neck. They were literally jumping on him. One of the witnesses, one of the inmates in that prison saw this happen, and they said it was like he was a trampoline. They were jumping on him. And it turns out that behind the scenes in Fishkill prison, there was an infamous gang of prison guards, like corrupt prison guards, that liked to call themselves the Beat Up Squad. And they were notorious for inflicting serious pain and terror on inmates. And as far as I'm aware, this was quite a known thing throughout the prison. Like, everyone knew that the Beat Up Squad was a thing. Allegedly, higher-ups knew about it, but they just didn't care and they didn't do anything about it. The Beat Up Squad were never disciplined for abusing the inmates. It was just a thing that everyone knew was going on and no one tried to stop. And right now, the Beat Up Squad had Samuel Harrell on the floor, defenseless, as they were just torturing him. And Samuel was quite a big guy as well. He was like over 6 foot tall. He was about 235 pounds, which is about 106 kilograms. He was quite a big guy. He should have been able to defend himself. But remember, there is 20 men versus him, and they have him on the ground. He had no chance, really. Before long, Samuel Harrell fell unconscious. He was just laying there, completely motionless on the ground, and police officers didn't slow down one bit. If anything, the attack only got worse from here. And now the prison guards started shouting racist slurs at him. They were kicking him in the head. They were spitting on him. Let me remind you, he is unconscious. And obviously, as all of this is going on, the other inmates throughout the prison have heard this. They've heard the commotion, and everyone's coming out to see what's going on. And prison guards don't like that. So they started snapping at these other inmates saying, "Get back in your cells, get back in the day room, or you'll be next." These other inmates witnessed these prison guards beating and torturing Samuel Harrell so badly that they started injuring themselves in the process, did these guards. One of them was beating him so hard that he gave himself an asthma attack. He was like out of breath, winded himself, gave himself an asthma attack. He had to go and sit down. Another one had to seek medical attention, I think for a broken foot or a broken hand, fracture of some kind, because he'd been beating Samuel so hard. And actually, medical staff were called in to this section of the hospital to come and deal with these prison guards, but they were conveniently kept away from Samuel Harrell. Like, the other prison guards allegedly formed like a bit of a barrier so that the medical staff didn't see that Samuel needed help, and instead they just treated these two officers, the asthma attack one and the one that fractured his hand. In fact, they were both put on stretchers. One of them had an asthma attack. Why do you need to be on a stretcher? They were put on stretchers and taken to the infirmary section of the prison to be treated. Meanwhile, Samuel Harrell is laid motionless, unconscious, pretty much dying on the floor. As the officers were being transported to the infirmary, Sergeant Garino was heard shouting at Samuel Harrell, who was on the ground, saying, "You want to put your hands on my staff? Drag this motherfucker to the stairs." Again, let me remind you, he is unconscious and he cannot hear any of this. They're all still shouting racist slurs at him and awful, awful things, when they know he can't hear it. By the way, as all of this had actually been happening, there was a female officer that went into one of the back rooms and she grabbed a sheet and she came in and covered over Samuel Harrell with it. Even the officers that aren't exactly joining in the attack, they know that this is awful, this is brutal, this man is being tortured, and they're trying to give him some sort of dignity, yet they're not stopping the abuse. They're not stopping the torture. They're seeing how bad this is getting, but all they're doing is covering his body with a sheet. But that sheet wasn't even on Samuel Harrell for all of 2 minutes before Sergeant Garino ordered 2 different prison guards to go over to Samuel, grab him, and throw him down a stairwell, which they did gladly. Reports say that his body landed in an unnaturally distorted position, and one of the inmates was quoted saying that his eyes were open, but they weren't looking at anything. At this point, finally, I think the guards were satisfied with the heinous torture that they had just carried out, and they decided it was enough. So one of them went and got a wheelchair and they brought it over to where Samuel Harrell's body lay on the ground motionless, blood all over him, and their idea was to put him in this wheelchair and wheel him back to his cell where he could just recover on his own in there. But in fact, before they started wheeling him away, they bound his arms and his legs together so that he, couldn't run away, as if he wasn't unconscious, as if he would even have the energy to be able to fight back. So they started pushing this wheelchair with the almost lifeless body of Samuel Harrell in it. And as they did, prison guards were forming like a human wall along where the other inmates were so that they couldn't see what had happened to Samuel Harrell. So they wheeled him all the way to the infirmary section of the prison where those other 2 prison guards were, and they called for him an ambulance, and they told the ambulance operator that he was suffering from an overdose. An overdose? He was beaten black and blue. He was bleeding all over his body. When has an overdose ever beaten someone up? Like, that's not what an overdose is at all, and it only takes someone to look at Samuel Harrell to realise that this isn't an overdose. But it didn't even matter, because get this, as soon as the ambulance arrived, prison staff told them to take those 2 prison guards that injured themselves during torturing Samuel Harrell. They said, oh, take those, they need the help. So the ambulance transported the prison guards to hospital for treatment. Meanwhile, Samuel Harrell is literally dying in this wheelchair. He needed urgent medical care and they didn't want to give him it. Eventually, about 20 minutes later, they finally called for another ambulance that came, picked up Samuel Harrell, transported him to hospital, and unfortunately, he was pronounced dead on arrival. Samuel's family were not informed of his passing at all that night. In fact, the first thing they heard was the following morning at 7:30 in the morning, his sister received an anonymous phone call that turned out to be from one of the inmates. And this inmate basically said to Samuel's sister, Sam got hit the night before and they took him and he hasn't been back and nobody's heard or seen from him. And that was pretty much all this guy said to Sam's sister, that he'd been beaten, they'd taken him away, and now no one had seen or heard from him. And so she is panicking. She has no idea what's gone on behind those prison walls. Finally, later on that morning, the prison staff themselves called her to inform her of her brother's passing. And I don't know what excuse they gave. I don't know how they said he died. I don't know if they tried to give an excuse. But when his body was sent for an autopsy, it was confirmed that his cause of death was a homicide. It was literally confirmed that Samuel Harrell was murdered. This wasn't an overdose. In fact, his toxicology report came back completely clear. There was not a single drug in that man's system. An overdose was completely out of the question. He was murdered. So Sam's family start demanding answers from the prison staff. But as I'm sure you can imagine, it was so hard for them to get anywhere with this because prison staff were hell-bent on covering this up. and lying to save their own skin. The prison tried to argue that Samuel Harrell was a dangerous, violent, aggressive individual, and on this one particular day they said that he assaulted a prison guard, and it took multiple members of staff to restrain him. But going back to the other inmates' descriptions of Samuel Harrell before this even kicked off, he was calm, wasn't he? He was just sitting at the desk. They said that he wasn't causing any issues. He never assaulted anyone. And when people actually started picking apart these excuses and saying, no, Sam wasn't aggressive, he wasn't violent, the prison very quickly changed their tune. All of a sudden, they started saying that Samuel Harrell had actually died from a synthetic cannabis drug that he'd smuggled into the prison. But obviously not. His toxicology report was completely clear. They were caught in a lie, and they had to make something up. And by making something up, they made things 10 times worse for themselves. In 2015, Samuel Harrell's family tried to file a lawsuit for his wrongful death in Fishkill prison. But as it turns out, they weren't the first people to sue or try to sue Sergeant Garino. He'd been accused of brutality towards multiple different inmates. There were alleged reports that he had smashed their heads against walls, that he'd jumped on their backs and broken their ribs. Samuel Harrell wasn't the first victim of his, and scarily, he might not be the last. Because the US Attorney's Office announced that they would not be pursuing any legal action against any of the prison staff. Not a single one. They wouldn't be charged, they wouldn't be arrested. I don't even think any of them were questioned in relation to Samuel Harrell's murder. The autopsy literally concluded that this was a homicide, yet no one's being disciplined. There was so much proof to say that his death was unlawful. Obviously the autopsy, but also multiple different inmates saw this happen, and they could give witness testimonies, but who are they going to give witness testimonies to? The police? The exact people that are trying to cover this up? And their excuse for not pursuing charges against any of these officers was that there was reasonable doubt that his death resulted from the use of excessive force. How? Where is that reasonable doubt? Literally, the conclusion of the autopsy says otherwise. It's just sickening that they can do that they can just say, no, I don't care what the evidence says, I'm not pursuing legal action. Like, how is that actually allowed to happen? Many of the guards that were involved in this incident still work in the prison system. In fact, one of them works for the NYPD now, which is absolutely terrifying. Samuel's widow, Diane, says everyone in that prison knows they killed him, and they're still getting away with it. Like I said, none of them were ever charged, convicted, sentenced. I don't even think they were disciplined internally, like told off by their boss for this, at the very least. Nothing was ever done. This whole thing was covered up and swept under the rug, and Samuel Harrell and his whole family have never seen any form of justice here at all. And it feels really weird leaving a case on that note, but that's where we stand today. Justice has not been served, although the autopsy clearly states that this was a homicide. Yet no one's being held responsible, and I don't think they ever will be, unless something big happens. But that is all I have for this case. I have a feeling that this one's gonna frustrate a lot of people, as it has me. This case has made me so angry. My heart just really goes out to Samuel Harrell himself and his whole family to be dealing with this and just knowing that it's almost impossible to get anywhere with it. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what you think down below in the comments, and thank you to Magellan TV for sponsoring. Like I said, you can click the link down below in the description and you'll get a 1-month free trial. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting the channel and helping me decide the cases that I cover. All of my tier 2 members are on screen right now, so thank you so much. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the join button down below. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below. If you want to watch another one of my videos, I'll leave you one right there. Or if you want to subscribe to my whole entire channel, you can click that circle right there. Okay, bye!